Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Hallam, and my capstone project focused on the positive and negative consequences of name, image, and likeness and its potential impact on universities. So, diving into this, it is important to define name, image, and likeness and determine where it came from. The discussion begins with the 2019 Fair Pay to Play Act that was passed in California that made it so colleges could no longer punish or sanction athletes for monetizing off of their own likeness. This caused a domino effect, causing many other states to follow suit and pass similar acts within their legislation. This pressure from the states caused the NCAA to react, and on June 9th, 2021, NCAA President Mark Emmett would declare all NCAA students will be allowed to profit off of their NIL. When someone's referring to the NIL, they are referring to the set of rules that allow an athlete to profit off of their own image and brand and make deals with businesses. One important caveat about this is not only do business deals have to be declared to the university, but athletes must receive permission from universities. So, the first purpose of this capstone project was to determine what shift in attitude and public opinion led to the NCAA to allow its athletes to monetize their own brand. This discussion really started to take place as people noticed the amount of money these athletes generated for the universities without receiving much in return. The next purpose of this essay was to delve into the potential impacts of the NIL on college athletes' lives and how it may affect the athlete at a personal level. Some areas in which we will see the biggest impact is role management and how the athlete navigates the many roles that come with being a student athlete. Lastly, I wanted to see how the universities will handle college athletics moving forward and what effect the NIL may have on college athletics as a whole. This ultimately begs the question, what role does athletics have on education and vice versa? It's hard to determine the true outcomes of these two intertwined entities, but the NIL definitely throws a wrench into how an athlete may perceive school. So now we have my areas of study. One of the first ways in which my areas of study influenced this project was the relationship between philosophy and law. Many legal theories and processes are related to morality and the right and wrong nature of people's actions. Morality is one of the big pillars of philosophy, thus philosophy and law go hand in hand. A legal theory that really provided a lens for examining this project was the realist law theory. This is the idea that all law derives from prevailing social interest and public policy. One example of this is how public interest prior to this was against athletes getting paid, but over time public interest has flipped and more people are now for college athletes getting paid. This had an effect on our court system as well, where early on we saw the courts often rule in favor of the NCAA, and now we were seeing a shift towards athletes winning more cases. Another way in which philosophy influenced this project is the overall skeptical and unbiased nature of philosophy. One of the biggest things I have learned in all of my philosophy classes is that it is extremely important to come into new ideas with a neutral approach and then to dissect that topic through logic and strong reasoning. I use this tool when approaching this project and try not to lean too heavy towards one side or the other. My other areas of study, communication, is focused on the encoding and decoding of messages, both verbally and non-verbally. This area of study provided me insight into how important the language used and how certain messages can be tactically put together. For example, the NCAA is extremely careful in its use of language when dissecting student athletes and always refers to the amateur nature of the institution as well as the importance of being a student. A huge impact that my area of study had on this capstone project was my COM 330 class, Sports Communication. This class served as a springboard for my project and heavily influenced my selection when determining the direction of my capstone. Not only did we examine the potential impact of the NIL in this class, we also looked at how important communication is at each level of a sports program. It was emphasized in this class that at every level we see differing levels of goals and how all of these goals may be communicated differently, thus causing goals to be misaligned. Ultimately, emphasizing how we got to a point in which athletes believe they deserve payment while universities are true to uphold education as the priority. Another way in which communication guided this project was through the myriad of journals that the field of communication is associated with. One example of this is the Journal of Sports Communication being used frequently in multiple sections of my capstone paper. Now diving into my capstone paper, we have the history of the student athlete. One of the major points of emphasis that has remained consistent throughout the lifespan of college athletics is the emphasis on players being students first and athletes second. This not only placed priority on education being the goal of any college pursuit, but also allowed universities to maintain that their athletes were amateurs. The NCAA argued that the amateur status was important because it helped maintain competitive balance between universities, giving each of them a level playing field. In addition to this, the scholarships players received, as well as room and board and the college experience, were seen as a sufficient payment, and for many years, public opinion agreed with the sentiment. Along with public opinion, many early court battles between players and the NCAA were ruled in favor of the NCAA. Some of the most influential decisions ruled upon by the courts were college athletics being a privilege, not a right for the student, as well as a scholarship being considered a contractual agreement between the player and university. Many of these prior court cases still influence policies created and enforced by the NCAA. So we have a little bit of a shift in perception now. Public perception did begin to shift around 20 years ago as the NCAA and its universities began receiving massive TV and brand deals. For example, in 2022-2023, the NCAA generated $1.28 billion, with $945 million of that coming from media and marketing deals. These massive figures generated by the NCAA spurred many to argue that players who were believed to be generating a large portion of this revenue were not being adequately paid for their services, with scholarships not being seen as enough anymore. Popular arguments surrounding this subject included a revenue split or an open market. One proposed reason for a revenue split, given by DJ Barry, argued using the Duke's men's basketball team as an example. He noted how currently the team's total scholarships are only worth roughly $800,000, or 2.4% of the total $33.7 generated by the team. Barry not only believes that this revenue split is too low, but the players should receive something closer to the NBA's revenue split, which is 50%, or $1.4 million for the average Duke player. It's important to note that 50% is a little steep for the average NCAA program, and non-revenue sports would be unable to come anywhere near this number. But another interesting note about these arguments is that in the modern NCAA environment, a form of open market does exist with the transfer portal. Players are no longer required to sit out for a year if they choose to transfer. So in addition to a shift in public opinion, the courts also began to shift in favor of the player as well. For example, we have the aforementioned Fair Pay to Play Act, which served as the precursor to the NIL, as well as O'Banion v. NCAA being an early indicator of this shift. O'Banion v. NCAA is especially interesting because it was one of the first times that the courts ruled upon a player's likeness following a dispute over a video game, stating that the NCAA didn't own a player's likeness after the person is no longer associated with the university. This kind of brings us to our modern era, and we have like the introduction of the NIL as well as social media's impact on the NIL. So because of these monumental shifts, the NIL was born, but with this introduction came new consequences and potential ramification. One of the tools the athletes have in their arsenal for the use of the NIL is social media. So one of the first positive consequences we see with the NIL is that it provides more equality amongst students and gives the athlete opportunity that every student outside of athletics have, which mainly is the ability to profit off their brand. For example, before the NIL, a member of the university's band was able to secure brand deals had they been offered or sign autographs without receiving any repercussions, while athletes were not able to do this. Another positive consequence we see is the NIL also has the ability for smaller sports and smaller divisions to grow. For example, many D3 athletes share their stories at these small schools on TikTok and receive brand deals from these posts. We also have seen college athletes such as Livy Dunn capitalize on their social media brand to bring more eyes towards women's gymnastics. And then finally, I believe Caitlin Clark is a fantastic example of how someone's play on the court allows for them to receive massive brand deals through the NIL, and how these brand deals lead to exposure, which then only further grow the sport. For example, during Clark's time at the University of Iowa, she partook in a national Gatorade ad that helped boost her popularity. Researchers Sabin and Jessup compared the NIL's ability for brand building outside of the university to the United States women's national team, and how when this team was finally able to market for themselves, the sport exploded and they received more deals than ever. Jessup and Sabin believe that this same phenomena will occur with women's college sports. And as the athlete is able to market for themselves, they will bring a whole new audience to the sport as a whole. But on the flip side of this, we do have the negative consequences of social media, with one of the most prevalent consequences being the introduction of the influencer role in the already busy life of the student athlete. The introduction of this role instigates many new hurdles in the student's life, with Fridley et al. Stating how the influence role is extremely time demanding, and time is not a commodity that a student has in abundance. This shift of time results in other areas taking hits, with the most likely to be education. In addition to the time constraints of this role, the added sociological and psychological burdens cannot be ignored. The NIL adds the additional pressure of athletes now having to perform for a brand, with compensation from this brand being tied not only to on-field performance, but also how well they engage with their audience. This adds the pressure of athletes always having to maintain a suitable image, with the most extreme cases turning young kids into businesses over athletes. So now kind of staying in the realm of the nature of business, we have regulations and extended stay. So the nature of the business could definitely be seen in the case of former UNLV quarterback Matthew Sluka. Reports are pretty mixed on the subject, with Sluka's side stating they were promised money from the offensive coordinator, while UNLV states no contract was ever put in front of them or the athletic department. Regardless of which side is correct, this case definitely exemplifies how unregulated the NIL currently is, and the need for common ground in how business surrounding NIL deals should be conducted. Cases such as these not only affect the player, but also damage a school's public image and ability to negotiate with future recruits. Following Sluka's departure from the team, he declared he'd redshirt and transfer to a new team for his sixth year. This is a common occurrence by athletes in the NIL era, with this issue currently running rampant in college football, and many athletes either redshirting for extra years or gaining extra years due to the pursuit of a postgraduate degree. While a fifth year has always been an option for college athletes, pursuing post-grad degrees. So while athletes have always had the option of pursuing post-grad degrees, athletes are now increasingly taking advantage of this pursuit with the transfer portal. Athletes such as Vanderbilt quarterback Diego Pavia went as far as suing the NCAA in order to extend his playing career. It has been seen in the short lifespan of the NIL that players are becoming incentivized to stay in college and pursue paydays, with education being the secondary reason for their attendance. Sorry about that. Now we are moving into micro-level inequalities. So if you haven't noticed, the majority of this presentation has been dominated by the discussions surrounding men's basketball and football. Revenue sports, basketball and football, and non-revenue sports has always been an issue for college athletics, but it only becomes more complicated with the introduction of the NIL. Not only will these revenue athletes receive better opportunities from the NIL, but they will also continue to dominate the discussion surrounding the topic, and many decisions will ultimately be made through the lens of revenue athletes. There also exists the potential that the NIL only furthers the gap between men and women's compensation within sports. While Caitlin Clark and women's basketball players have been able to harness the NIL, some scholars argue that Title IX needs to be updated in order to protect equality amongst which athletes receive NIL deals and how much these deals are worth. The NIL also raises concerns about competitive balance and how it has the potential for the Power 5 conferences to only become more powerful as they continue to expand and dismantle other conferences. For example, Michigan was just able to secure a $10 million deal with the number one high school athlete in the class of 2025, showing how much money they have at their disposal. This becomes an interesting dichotomy to UNLV, who is unwilling to pay their former quarterback a tiny fraction of that price. The NIL also has the potential to allow for certain boosters to influence universities' decisions because of how much they donate to the program. This was seen in the early 2000s with the University of Miami, and we may see a repeat of this occurrence if the NIL is not careful. All right, so this brings us to our conclusion. So, as I've kind of had tried to display with this presentation, the NIL is an extremely nuanced and difficult subject to navigate within college athletics. Not only does it have positive consequences for the players, such as the players finally being able to receive a piece of the pie through monetization of their brand, but also many negative consequences and potential hurdles that need to be covered, such as role management and the micro level inequalities will come up still need to be addressed. Because of the NIL's infancy, many subjects still need to be explored, and only time will tell how everything will unfold. Ultimately, one question that will need to be answered is what role do education and sports have with one another? Can each of these sides prosper, or was the NCAA right and the amateur status of athletes is extremely important in upholding the legacy of college athletics? One thing that scholars agree on is that the judicial system will continue to play a role in how NCAA policies are dictated and determined. Despite frequent denial of wanting to be involved, the past has indicated that decisions made by the courts have always been a major part in creating the landscape and will always be a part in creating the landscape for college athletics. And so finally, I would just like to leave with this quote from former University of Alabama head coach Nick Saban, who argued for NIL regulation and a revenue split, stating that without it, there's potential for a pay-for-play system and a free agency system that has no guidelines, so there's no competitive balance. I think there's going to be a lot of places that will say we'll create a caste system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for checking out my capstone project, and I really appreciate it and look forward to the questions.